The Florida Podcast Network, the voice of Florida.
From Mallory Square in Key West to the Governor's Mansion in Tallahassee and all points beyond, you're listening to the Florida Beer Podcast, powered by FloridaBeerBlog.com, your source for all things related to the craft beer community in the Sunshine State. And now your host, Dave Butler.
Hey gang, welcome to another episode of the Florida Beer Podcast, powered by FloridaBeerBlog.com. This is Dave, your host and author, feeling a little under the weather, but that's okay. I can at least record this, and I can definitely tell you that when I recorded the interview today, things are a little bit better. So we are taking a little field trip to Georgia, as I am wont to do from time to time. Actually, I've never really been to Georgia. I've been through it, but never really to it. And I got a couple interviews set up, which I am excited about. I think they're pretty cool, and I think you're going to have a great time. Now, on my way to Atlanta, I asked a few people, where should I go? Who should I talk to? What should I do? One of the people I spoke to was Dustin Jeffers. He's been on the show before. He used to be the brewmaster over at Saltwater Brewery. He went to a few other locations. He was actually on the show again when he went over to Three Sons. And now he is with Next Glass, which is the company that owns such platforms as Untapped and Unzer, which is pretty cool. He's doing a great job over there. But he mentioned that I needed to go to the Brick Store Pub in Decatur. And I'm going to be honest with you, I'm very happy that he mentioned that. It is easily one of the best craft beer places I have ever been to. And I, put that up with bars and breweries and tap rooms. And if you consider this to be less than a brewery, because it's not a brewery, you gotta get that out of your system, because Brick Store Pub is nothing short of amazing. It's got 3 different bars in its 2-story facility the building itself is over 130 years old. It used to be a bank. There are vaults in the bottom. The general public does not get to go down there. I got to go down there. But there are 3 bars. Obviously, the main bar at the lower floor has the majority of their beer selections. Directly above the main bar is where they have their cask engine. So they have a couple cask beers on tap always. And then once you go up and kind of over to the left, there is a new section and row of taps devoted specifically to Belgian beers, which is phenomenal. That's where I sat down with our interviewer today, Neil Callaghan. He is the beer manager at Brick Store Pub. There's only 3 Advanced Cicerones in the state of Georgia. He is one of them. And he had worked at Brick Store Pub previously and then left for the better part of a decade to be the marketing manager at Cigar City Brewing in Tampa. So he was kind of the perfect person to talk to about the differences between Florida and Georgia's craft beer scenes, talking a lot about the beautiful facility that is Brick Store Pub and the amazing tap list that he has and that he curates, and how they take beer very seriously. I cannot say enough good things about this place. So if you are in the Atlanta area, please make sure to get yourself down to Decatur to check out Brick Store Pub. And once you listen to this interview, you're going to be able to see why. So Neil Callaghan, beer manager at Brick Store Pub in Decatur, Georgia. Enjoy. So we'll start off with the beer, not just the beer, but the specific beer that I am currently holding in my hand. Can you please give a rundown of what this is, who made it, and especially why?
Sure. So you are drinking a beer called Backstein Winkel that is brewed for us out in Wattu, out in Belgium. It's a beer that was originally developed by the folks behind St. Bernardus for our 20th anniversary. For our 20th anniversary at the Brick Store, we did 20 different collaborations, including with Cigar City. And one of those collaborations was with St. Bernardus, and they're a brewery that we've supported for a long time and we've had a great relationship with. Ab 12 it's a classic. It's one of the best beers in the world. So we have that on draft 365 days a year. So as a result, we were lucky enough to send some folks out to Belgium to brew with St. Bernardus. So it's a Saison, it's 6.2%. It's called Baksteen Winkel, which is Flemish for brick store pub. So it's essentially a house beer for us. It's available a few other places around the country, but it's essentially our house beer. It's named after us. It's pretty neat.
So just to let you know, this is clearly not a sports bar in a strip mall somewhere. This is, for all intents and purposes, the real deal. And in fact, only a few days before I was here, the sort of almost patron saint of craft beer in Florida, Bob Sylvester, was around. And I think you actually had a bottle of one of his Saisons that had been aged.
That's right. We had a 2017 Lecto Divina, I believe it was. Yeah, everybody knows Bob. If you're a professional brewer, probably anywhere in the world, you know Bob Sylvester. And he was in town for the Atlanta Cask Ale tasting, and it's great hanging out with him, catching up with him. I know he's up in North Carolina these days, hanging out with Wayne Wombles, and yeah, Bob's the best.
Well, you've mentioned also Wayne, and obviously people know Bob, people know Wayne, but they may not necessarily know you. And that's part of the reason why I wanted to get you on the show, because not only are they from the Florida area, or at least that's where they were well known, but that's where you cut your teeth. So how did you sort of get into beer? How did that journey start for you?
Sure. So I'm from New York originally, grew up in Long Island, and I was getting into beer. I had a friend who was running the beer department of the Whole Foods on the Bowery in Manhattan. And this is 2007, 2008. There weren't bottle shops. There was places like Blind Tiger. There were a very, very small number of cool craft beer places, and real estate in New York being what it is, there were very few breweries actually based in New York. Other half wasn't around. Brooklyn Brewery was around, and they were one of, you could probably count them on two hands, the number of actual production breweries in New York City. So all that to say, hanging out with my friend Corey, who now runs a beer bar called Beer Street up in Brooklyn. It's a phenomenal place. He helped me get into beer and just kind of opened my eyes to what beer could be. He put a St. Bernardus Ab 12 in front of me for the first time. He put Norval in front of me for the first time. And I was bartending at that point at a few dives that had decent enough beer. So all that to say, I ended up moving to Athens, Georgia, which was a great little college town. And
more than a few bands that have come out of Athens,
there's
a couple. Just a few.
There's a couple. Your B-52s and your REMs and your Neutral Milk Hotels and your Pylons, and there's a bunch of good ones. So
you're in Athens. I would assume that you are connecting with, who's the big one that's there? I cannot remember. Who's the big brewery that's there?
So Terrapin was there at that point.
Thank you.
They were up and brewing and moved there in 2010. So Terrapin was around. There was a brew pub called Copper Creek, and that was really about it. Creature Comforts was, I think, just kind of a twinkle in some of those guys' eye. It wasn't they probably didn't even have a business plan at that point. So all that to say, I ended up getting a job with Trapeze, which was a great beer bar out there. At the time, it was ranked as the number 11 beer bar in the world, and sort of in spending more and more time behind the bar there. And the story of me getting a job there is actually pretty interesting. So I had just interviewed to be the produce manager at a supermarket. So I was having a tough time finding a job and said, screw it, I'll take a job wherever. So I had the interview, thought the interview went great, and brought myself out to Trapeze, this beer bar, to celebrate. So I was, all right, great, this is my job now. I'm going to be the produce guy. And the guy behind the bar turned out to be the owner. And he and I ended up hanging out and talking about beer for hours. And he said, you really know your stuff. I said, yeah, I'm actually new in town and have bartending experience. So are you looking for somebody? He said, not really, but you know your stuff, so you can start on Friday. And so that guy's name is Eric Johnson, and he is currently the owner and brewmaster of Wild Heaven, which is up here in Georgia. And they do distribute down in Florida as well. They do emergency drinking beer.
Yes, I was about to go there. I got waylaid, but yes, I remember the distinctive yellow can. If you haven't seen it, emergency drinking beer is a really awesome looking can for all the wrong reasons.
Right. It's killer beer. And so all that to say, was in Athens for a few years, decided to come to Atlanta and got hooked in with the brick store, knowing if you're in the Southeast and you're into beer, you've probably heard of the brick store. So worked with them for about a year and a half, and I never would have left the brick store if the opportunity hadn't presented itself with Cigar City. So there was an opening for the tap room manager at Cigar City. This is 2014.
Now, was this the original tap room before the massive renovation?
This was phase 2 of the tap room. So if folks have been to the old tap room, that was just the front bar. And then by the time I started, there was the back bar as well. There was no food. There was still, the shuffleboard over in the corner. And
the first time I went there, it was just the front bar. They had just closed the food window, but the window was still there.
Right. When they had that little sandwich shop over in the corner, right?
Yeah, there was a cigar roller there.
Yeah.
Back when they still had one there.
That's right. Yeah. So the guy who turned me on to the job at Cigar City was Charlie Mears, who's now the owner of Magnanimous in Tampa. So there's quite a lot of connection between Georgia and Florida when it comes to brewing. And Wayne was a brewer in Buckhead Brewing. So he had brewed at a few places in Georgia. So Wayne knows everybody in Georgia, and there's quite a lot of connection there.
And that's interesting because especially here, you take a look at the Panhandle, and the Panhandle breweries tend to go up a little bit. They tend to go into the lower part of Alabama, tend to go into the lower part of Georgia.
L.A., lower Alabama.
Exactly. With the exception of, Terrapin and, the one that makes 420, my beer.
Sweetwater.
Thank you so much. You don't get a ton of Georgia beers once you go below I-10, basically. Mm-hmm. And especially when you're down south like me, there's almost nothing there. So why do you think that is, and how much connection between the two states can really has room to grow?
Plenty of room to grow. To the point, I've actually seen almost the opposite, where traveling around in Georgia or traveling anywhere outside of Georgia, really the only Florida brewery that you see on a shelf is probably going to be Cigar City. It's probably going to be High Life.
In fact, that is correct. The only two breweries that I saw on a shelf at Total Wine here was Cigar City and, of all beers, Bay Cannon.
Huh. That's interesting. They make killer beer. Good folks. And there are the specialty, the tiny bottle shops that will carry, an ology bottle or carry a odd breed bottle, or might get a random J. Wakefield bottle here and there. So this sprinkling of the specialty, but with any real distribution traction, it's really just Cigar City. And I would kind of say the same thing to your point. You've got Creature Comforts that barely leaves the state of Georgia. They kind of took that New Glarus model where they said we want to own our backyard and own the state of Georgia in a way that nobody can mess with. And I think they've done a pretty great job. Terrapin really wasn't available in too many places before the Miller Coors partnership. So, to answer your question, I don't have a very good, succinct reason why you don't see as many of those brands traveling, with the exception of the smaller stuff, the stuff that is never going to be on a Publix or a Kroger shelf.
And we'll definitely talk about one of the breweries that you have here on tap with the big friends of ours. But so you're in Tampa. You're heading up the Spruce Street beer mecca that is Cigar City. How did you get from there to Brick Store, where we are today?
The first year and a half, really, I was at the Cigar City tap room. I was able to really kind of drive a focus back to, not a focus back to beer, but really having at the time come from the Brick Store, which was a full-service restaurant with liquor and wine and food and all that. And I came to the tap room where there was no food, no wine, no liquor. It was just beer, and it was just one brewery's beer. So in my mind, the space in someone's brain that's taken up by a full food menu and liquor and all that behind the Cigar City bar should really be taken up with just Cigar City. You should, you're not kind of going in with a cursory understanding of these beers. You should know everything about these beers. And we had a great staff, and they were eager to learn, but there really wasn't a formal structure for them to find out. I remember asking, one of the bartenders when I started, I said, "Hey, we have this new beer, Guayabera, on draft. How do you find out what that beer is so you can tell guests about it?" And she goes, I guess I ask one of the brewers if he's having a shift beer at the end of his day. There was no kind of formal, the staff should really live and breathe Cigar City beer. So really spent the first year and a half getting the staff to live and breathe Cigar City beer, formal training and emails, and new beer would come out. They would get a 3-page long email explaining what the beer was, what the ingredients were, what the ABV was, where the name came from, tasting notes, all that. So in doing that, Joey Redner, the founder of Cigar City, was still very much involved in the day-to-day.
I was going to say, this was before the Canarchy.
Correct. This is, 2014, 2015, and Canarchy happened in early 2016. And it seemed like part of why Joey, I can't speak for him, but part of why he seemed kind of interested in partnering up was it freed up his life a little bit. He, I think, was looking to take a little bit of a step back from the day-to-day. And part of that day-to-day was naming the beers. It was doing the interviews. It was explaining the brand to people. So through all of these emails that I was sending to the staff and all this training I was doing with the staff, Joey said, I think you could be a great voice. I think you could take over a lot of those responsibilities for me. So that's what I ended up doing for really the last 5 to 6 years of my time at Cigar City. Was my title varied a little bit, but it was essentially brand manager or brand voice. So I was the person doing the interviews. I was the person doing as we expanded, as we went from essentially 98% of our beer being sold in Florida to opening up 42 states in the span of about 4 years. When we would go out and meet with a new distributor or meet with different bars or restaurants or supermarket chains, I would be the person there saying, hey, this is what our brand means. This is the history of Cigar City. This is a history of how we draw inspiration from Tampa. And it was an opportunity of a lifetime to have Joey feel like he was handing me his brand. Essentially. It was incredibly honored. I felt incredibly honored. I learned so much and got to see the world talking about Cigar City for years.
And how difficult a culture was that to introduce people to, especially in Texas or Kansas or California? Tampa is its own sort of beast, and obviously the big flagship beer of Cigar City, unless nobody can really truly pronounce correctly.
Oh yeah, we would get JLA, JLI, Jolly Ollie. That was always my favorite. Oh, there was a lot of educations to be done. Absolutely. Not naming any southern states by name, but Alabama especially. You'd go into a bar and they go, Cigar City, so y'all brew cigars there? Just here's a highlight, please. Just have a highlight. So explaining, look, Cigar City, it's named after the cigar making history of Tampa, and highlight, look, it's this game, and it was very popular in Florida, down to Florida Cracker. That was one that required a lot of explanation.
Yeah, I can, which is funny because, the beer, it would be pretty easy because everybody just wants, this more flavorful version of Blue Moon. But the Florida Cracker, that's a long history that, not everybody sort of knows. The other one being my personal favorite that Cigar City ever did, which was Maduro.
Oh, yeah.
And if you're a cigar smoker, you instantly know the name. And if you're not, here comes the explanation.
Exactly, yeah. And that was the first beer that Cigar City ever brewed back in 2009. And that beer, that's my favorite Cigar City beer, and that beer on cask. And I was lucky enough to kind of strong arm the guys back in Tampa a few months ago. So they sent us 8 casks of Maduro. That beer on a beer engine is unreal. It's
nice.
Like top 5 favorite beers ever is Maduro on a beer engine.
So that it's a long stretch from being in Tampa, drinking Tampa IPAs, and of course, lots of brown ales, to slinging Belgian beers in Decatur, Georgia. So what brought you back to the Brick House?
So I've never worked for better people. That the folks, the 3 guys that started the brick store, they're wonderful people.
I got the name wrong.
Hey, it happens every single day.
I've got the Commodores stuck in my head right now. So
it happens the best of us. Never worked for better people other than the owner that's currently handing me a beer. Phenomenal ownership, and this. I know you guys have walked around a little bit, but this place is special.
You need to tell us about the history of this building. It's insane. If you can imagine a building that was built by George Washington and somehow frozen in time, I guess. And then
the building's...
Yeah, it's amazing.
Building's about 130, 140 years old. It was a general store way back when. That's where the brick store name comes from. But it's... Having traveled around with Cigar City, again, I'm super fortunate that Cigar City sent me literally around the world to go preach the gospel of Cigar City beer, going to all these world-class beer places like Akkurat in Stockholm, or going to Falling Rock in Colorado, or going to Toronado in San Francisco. Amazing, incredible places. Please, not taking anything away from them. I've still never been to a better beer bar than the Brick Store. The attention to detail, not only just the ambiance and the decor, again, everything is attention to detail. The approach to the beer. You will never get a beer in a mislabeled glass. You're never going to get a St. Bernardus beer in a Schoof glass. Never, ever. Like, the thought of it makes our heads explode.
And I kind of want to pause there and talk about that for a couple of seconds, because the tap room, the monstrous tap room, has kind of become de rigueur in some places. And you've got some businesses, whose name I will not mention, that have 100 plus taps. They're always going to be served in either a shaker, pint, or a tulip. How, I guess, does that make your blood boil and cringe as much as I do in terms of product changeover, tap cleanliness, serving?
Absolutely. When I go to places like that, I usually stick with either stuff that I know is pulling through quickly, to your point about cleanliness and stale beer, or I stick with packaged beer, because the reality is you have 100 draft lines, 80 of them are not moving. 80 of them are sitting oxidizing, and it doesn't do anybody any favors. So the Brick Store is unique in a lot of ways. And one of them is we have overall, between our downstairs bar, our Belgian bar, our cask bar, and we have an outside bar as well, we have 44 draft lines. That's a lot of draft lines. That's more than enough. That's one thing I get. I think you and I are of the same mind, Dave, where you walk in and you see more than like 20 draft lines at any bar, and you go, some of this beer is just sitting here getting old. This isn't doing anybody any favors. So a huge draft list does not a good beer bar make. And likewise, a solid lineup of beers does not a good beer bar make. Some of these beer bars that are on the list of best beer bars in the world have phenomenal beer programs, but you're going to get a Pliny the Elder and a shaker pint. That doesn't do the beer any favors. That doesn't do the brewery any favors. That doesn't do the drinking experience any favors.
So I hate to ask, how many different styles of glassware do you have in this building?
Oh, you'll see a little bit later. The hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cases of glassware that we have. I spend a lot of time going up and down stairs carrying boxes of glassware here as part of my job. But the reality is it makes a difference. We don't serve the most esoteric beer in the world. We have plenty of esoteric beer, but we'll serve beer that you can get at probably 4 other places within a 5-mile radius. But you're going to get it in the proper glassware for the style, or the branded glassware from the brewery, and you're going to get it at the right temperature, and the beer lines are going to be cleaned within the last 2 weeks. The beer selection is absolutely critical for a great beer bar, but it's really how the how the bar handles the beer once it's within the doors. Are they putting it on clean draft lines? Are they pouring it with the right amount of head, with good long-lasting head? Are they putting it at the right glassware? Is it at the right temperature? Those are things that I think the Brick Store really does better than almost anywhere else I've ever been in the world. So that's what brought me back.
I'm still cringing on having to drink a beer out of a frosted mug last night. Every time I see that, it just makes me cringe. Mm-hmm. But I kind of want to go back, because you've got the glassware, you've got the beer, you've got the cleanliness, you've got all these things, and that means absolutely nothing if your staff isn't good. And since you talked about what you did in the program that you created at Cigar City, what did you do here at Brick Store to give the employees here the same amount of knowledge and the same amount of talkability to the beers that you have on tap?
It's a lot of work, and that's what takes most of my day, to be honest. So we do a lineup at the beginning of each shift. So the morning shift and the night shift, they have to listen to me talk about beer for basically 10 to 15 minutes. Here's the new beer we have on. Here's the brewery it came from. Funny story about the brewery. So it's like, we got this new beer from Cigar City. So the name Cigar City, it's, going back to the history of cigar manufacturing and tobacco in Tampa. And it's this beer called Maduro. It's named after a dark wrapper on a cigar. It's got oats in the grist, so that oats give it, a little bit of a creaminess, 5.5%. All right, next beer, let's talk about. So our draft list changes a few times each day. So each shift that you come in to work at the Brick Store, you're going to hear me talk for about 10 minutes about really every nuance of the new beer. I do beer school twice a week, hour and a half twice a week, where and it's not mandatory. It's pure volunteer. We want people to be excited to come in and learn more about the product that they're serving. And I think at the end of the day, we instill enough pride between myself and the owners and Sam, the GM, pride in this place. And the expectation, I think, is very clear to the staff that we do everything we can to be among the best beer bars in the world. And not all of that, but a lot of the onus on that falls on you, because you don't know who that guest is that you're talking to. You don't know if it's Dave, who runs a beer podcast. You don't know if that's Wayne, the brewmaster from Cigar City. You don't know if that's the guy that owns J.J. Taylor, the distributor in Florida. You have to go into every interaction with your guest expecting that person lives and breathes beer and knows every single thing about beer. So, and it's also making them comfortable in the sense that somebody asks you a question and says, "Oh, I'm looking for, Flanders brown ale, but something that's not from Rodenbach, something that really exhibits, less of a Roselaire quality." I don't expect every server to know that, but making the server comfortable to say, "You know what? I'm not quite sure about that. Let me grab Neil, our beer director, or let me grab somebody that can probably answer that question for you." It's, to kind of give another Florida example there, we don't expect every server at Bern Steakhouse to know every single thing about that massive wine list. They have a sommelier for that. And that's sort of the role that I play as well.
Gotcha. Now, you've obviously got the downstairs regular restaurant sort of tap room area, but we're sitting upstairs in what is possibly what I want my house to look like. And we are in where you spoke, the New Belgian area.
Right.
I guess what was the impetus to create a sort of haven within a haven for just Belgians?
Part of that goes to the laws in Georgia. So up until 2003, there was a 6% ABV cap on beer in Georgia. So essentially all of the beer that we serve at the Belgian bar today, none of it was able to be poured up until 2003. And the three guys that started the brick store and are still the sole three owners, the three of them were big proponents of that law change. They went to the State House, they met with legislators, and they worked really, really hard to raise that ABV cap. So they have done a lot of traveling, as have I, to Belgium and to other parts of the world, and they fell in love with Belgian beer, and they said, we want to do anything we can to be able to pour this beer, because the world needs to experience these beers. So in changing that law, that opened up our ability to open the Belgian bar, and then we took about 2 years to remodel this space and turn it into the Belgian bar, where we have 8 lines of beer just from Belgium. Nothing on draft comes on the Belgian bar that isn't from Belgium. Most of the packaged beers from Belgium. We have all of the Trappist beers in package that we can get our hands on. And it's really just falling in love for, I think, the owners with the history and with the idiosyncrasies of Belgian beer. We love all types of beers here, but there's just something about Belgium, and there's something about, again, just sort of the individualistic nature of each Belgian brewer. You say to Danny from Fantôme, brew me a Blanche, brew me a wit beer, and it's going to taste completely different than saying the same thing to De La Seine or saying the same thing to De Dole. Or each one of them takes such a idiosyncratic, weird, for lack of a better word, weird approach to brewing, and that's something to be celebrated. And so is the environment. Going to a place like Culminator, or going to just rattle off any amazing beer bar in Belgium. We wanted to recreate that feeling, and I think we've done a pretty decent job here.
Yeah, it's absolutely fantastic. There's so much that I want to try, but I just don't have the sobriety to do so. But right next to it is the tiniest, coolest little place, which is your cask bar.
Right. So that was a COVID development. Another thing that we've all fallen in love with, especially Dave, the owner, who was just up here bothering me, is British beer and cask beer. And part of that not only is the beer, but it's the environment of being in a pub. The Brits really emphasize this third place where you're not home, you're not at work. You need that third place where you feel comfortable and you feel like you can relax a little bit. And the beer really helps foster that environment in the sense that it's low alcohol, so you can have a couple. It's softer carbonation, so it doesn't fill you up as quickly. And it's served cool, not cold, so you get more natural flavor out of the beer. And Dave, he's over there watching football right now, so he's a big soccer guy. We have never, outside of an occasional World Cup, so every 4 years we'll put a few TVs up just for World Cup, but it could be the World Series. The Braves could be, playing Game 7 of the World Series, and you will not find a TV in the brick store. But there's something just kind of very British about watching some football while you're drinking some cask ale. So we do have a TV. It only is We have something that covers it up. You only see the TV when there's a big football match on, mostly Premier League.
Gotcha. That's awesome. What's the room behind it? Because you almost have this little, I don't want to call it a jail cell, but sort of a vault of some amazing looking beers just sitting, aging wonderfully.
Right. Yeah. So that's our cellar room. We keep that at 55 degrees Fahrenheit year round. So we have a cooling unit, keeps it at perfect cellar temperature. It's where we keep our vintage beer. We have really, I think, honed the styles and the brewers and the specific beers that we put in that cellar. You know, we don't throw anything in there. We certainly don't throw IPAs. We really don't throw stouts in there either. We found that the bell curve on stouts is pretty narrow. You know, within 2 or 3 years on, I'd say 9 out of 10 stouts, it's falling off. It's not getting any better. But mixed culture beer, barley wines, stouts from certain producers like Cigar City, you know, Marshall Zhukov's holds up pretty well over 5 or 6 years. That's not the same situation with a lot of other brewers. So yeah, we have over 600 different vintage labels in there, and our inventory right now is somewhere in the 5,000 to 6,000 bottle range.
That's amazing. I was going to say, and then where else have we not seen? Where else does the brick store kind of have things that are hiding around?
So we have a space that we don't normally talk about. It may or may not be below street level, and it may or may not be in an old bank vault. That's about all I can tell you. It's not a space where people generally, you know, when we are lucky enough to get world-class brewers in here, you know, we had Ryan Dowdle from Angry Chair was here last night. So we were able to bring him down to a certain space that may or may not exist, and, you know, kind of show him really some cool stuff that we're doing down below street level, but it's not a public facing space. And if you ask us about it, we'll probably say we don't know what you're talking about with a wink and a nod.
Gotcha. Understood. How difficult has it been to introduce where we are, the kind of outliers of Atlanta, to a Belgian beer tap list, a slightly more eclectic tap list, things that aren't the standards? And so far beyond even what some normal craft breweries would do.
You know, we have the luxury of being able to bring in a single keg of something, you know, to the point of a brewery like at Cigar City. If we made a weird, you know, Belgian Saison with some weird ingredients, at Cigar City, we were locked into 15 barrels. That's a lot of beer. At the brick store, we're able to bring in a single keg, a 20-liter keg, and it's here and it's gone in a week. Or even if it doesn't move very, very quickly, we're not saddled with an entire batch of beer the way that you are at a brewery. So we have that advantage over a production facility in that sense, to the point of just introducing your average guest to even the more common Belgian beers like Orval or Ab 12. It's really about the space. There's plenty of folks that come into this incredible Belgian feeling, wonderful space, and they drink a cocktail. They're actually not all that interested in Belgian beer, but they see the Belgian advertisements and they see the Saison, or I'm sorry, the St. Bernardus mural, and they see kind of all the Orval stained glass and all of these homages that we have to Belgian beer, and you can't help but be drawn in by it. And you can't help but talk to your server and say, I see this big St. Bernardus mural. Like, what is that? Oh, well, hey, we have Ab 12, you know, it's this incredible brewery. It's an Abbey brewery. They used to brew the beer for Westverletten. If you don't know what Westverletten? Well, let me tell you about that. And to kind of wrap everything up, it also touches on the point about TVs. This space is about conversation and beer. You know, there's food and there's wine and there's liquor, and those things are great, but it's really about conversation and beer. When you go to a bar that has a TV, you end up just staring at the damn TV, and it's even to the point about service. You know, you're sitting here looking at a TV and your server comes up, and you're not going to strike up a conversation with your server or ask your server about this or that, or even notice that there's this cool advertisement for a creek or this cool advertisement for St. Bernardus on the wall. We are an attention to detail type place, and not having those distractions, I think, draws the guests in and makes them appreciate those attention to details.
Awesome. So obviously on the tap list and obviously in our conversation, Florida has come up quite a bit. And it seems like either the brewers, I guess, are they coming for that which is brick store, or is a lot of it coming for you, or is it kind of a combination of the both because of exactly what this is and what you and the owners here have truly built?
The product has always been here. The three owners have never come into, they're in the pub almost every single day, and they never come into the pub going, oh, this is great if we can just keep it exactly how it is. They come in every single day, we're going, oh, we can do that better. Well, what if we redid this? What if we took that down and moved that here and then started doing it this way every single day, which is wonderful. The pub has always been something special. What I think I'm bringing to the table that I don't think they've been as focused on is bringing in folks from outside the South. In traveling literally around the world with Cigar City, I would always talk about Brick Store. I'd always say, oh, there's plenty of great beer bars, but this is my favorite, and it's in Atlanta. And oftentimes people would go, I never heard of it. I'd be in California and they'd go, oh, brick house, brick. I've never heard of it. So I think what I have the ability to do, because a lot of what I was doing, or a big part of what I was doing at Cigar City, also involved Hunapoo's Day. And it was bringing in 200 brewers from around the world and, really creating something really special as far as a beer festival. So building those relationships and kind of getting to talk to brewers and building just friendships with these people, I'm now able to run into them at other places and go out to other beer festivals and say, hey, I'm up at this place called the Brick Store now. Let's do an event. Let's send us some beer. I was talking about that with Ryan from Angry Chair. Like, send us some kegs. Let's set up an event. And I feel fortunate that when people do send us some beer and when they do say, well, I've never been to Atlanta. I've never had a reason to send beer to Atlanta, but I know Neil. So yeah, we'll do that. And then when they come in here and they see the cask bar and they see the Belgian bar and they see the space that may or may not exist downstairs and they go, this is incredible. This is just absolutely wonderful. So I think what I'm able to bring to the table is just bringing in an outside audience. Again, if you're in Atlanta and you like beer, the Brick Store. But it's really bringing in folks that otherwise probably wouldn't come to Atlanta because, to kind of touch on the point about laws once again, Georgia was so under-indexed on breweries. And under-indexed, we had great beer. We had this place, we had the Porter, we had Argosy, we had some really great beer bars. But if you're a beer geek and you're from Chicago, you're going to go, all right, I'm going to go on a beer trip. Let's go to Tampa. Let's go, because I know Cigar City and Angry Chair and Cycle and Green Bench. I know those guys. Or I'm going to go to Asheville, or I'm going to go to San Diego. Atlanta wasn't really on the list. And part of that, again, to the point of the laws, there were no tap rooms in the state of Georgia until 2017. So you couldn't walk into a brewery, a production facility, and order a pint of beer. You couldn't have a six-pack to go. You couldn't anything. They found exceptions as far as samples. You could do samples as part of a tour, and that was during certain hours. But it was that you found ways to collect revenue around that, but you couldn't chart. You couldn't say you want a pint of Tropicalia from Creature Comforts, $7. Here you go. You could not collect revenue that way. So as a result, not only did breweries not open in Georgia, but the breweries that did open in Georgia had to open big. They had to open with a 15 or a 20 or a 30 barrel brew house. Because if you're the only legal entity that you can actually sell your beer to is your distributor in the state of Georgia before that law changed. So why is a distributor going to pay any attention to you if you're only sending them 2 kegs of beer? They're going to go, this isn't worth my time. And it's not. It's not worth their time. So all that to say, not only were the breweries not opening, but the ones that were opening up and really struggling because they would have to brew a whole bunch of beer and find homes for a 30 barrel batch of beer. So Georgia was very, very much behind the times, but that law changing in 2017 was a huge, huge boon. And now we have breweries that people are noticing nationally and internationally, like Creature Comforts and Halfway Crooks and Elsewhere and now Inner Voice and Little Cottage. There's now reasons for the city to be more of a beer destination outside of just the Brick Store and the Porter.
And you think it's done that pretty well? The quality of the breweries that are starting to show up in the area are where they need to be, or even better? Oh,
absolutely. And I do think that part of it is because of the Brick Store and the Porter and some of these other great venues because the brewers that are now opening their own breweries, almost all of them would come to meet with business partners or work on their business model at the brick store, and they would have the best Belgian strong dark ale in the world, or they would have the best whatever Czech pale lager, because we're able here at the pub to pour some really great world-class beer. So you're a brewer in Georgia, you hang out at the brick store, and you brew a Czech pale lager, you go, well, it's got to be as good as this one. Or I brew a strong dark ale, well, it's got to be as good as St. Bernardus Ab 12.
And I guess the last question that I want to say, because I still want some of those fish and chips before I head on out and some more of those beers, which is amazing, but I was told about a sea bass stain on the ceiling. That sounds like a story.
Sure. So I can't say I was there for the great sea bass explosion of the 2000s. But what I can tell you about Sea Bass, the beer, it was named after a guy named Sebastian who worked at Cigar City way, way early days, like 2009, maybe even if he went into 2010, I'd be surprised. I only met him once, I think. Actually, in all places, I met him in Estonia. I was in Estonia for a beer festival, and I was working for Cigar City, and he came up to the Cigar City booth, and he said, I'm Sebastian. I used to work there. I said, oh, that's great. You know, I don't think I've heard your name. He said, well, you might know me. I'm Sea Bass. I go, oh, I've heard about Sea Bass. So Cigar City made a beer named after him. It was called Sea Bass. And it was actually the first Cigar City beer I ever had. I bought it at the Whole Foods on the Bowery in Manhattan in like 2009. So it was I think they marketed it as a Flanders Red. This was made, you know, going back to the Bob Sylvester and early Wayne Wombles days, this was made when Cigar City had an open fermenter in the middle of the brew house.
I had no idea they had one.
They had an open fermenter, and there's a reason why most people don't know about it and why it was scrapped very quickly, you know, with the warm weather and just with the sort of environment in that warehouse on Spruce Street, you'd get all kinds of weird stuff floating around into that open fermenter. So all that to say, this, or maybe, you know what, they might have called it it was a dark saison. That's what they called it. But it ended up tasting much more like a Flanders Red. It had all this acetobacter and all this just weird quality to it. So all of those bugs essentially that ended up in the beer continue to metabolize inside of the bottle, and as they metabolize, they create CO2. So I don't know of one bottle of Sea Bass that when you opened it, it didn't shoot beer all the way up to the ceiling of whatever building you're in. So all that to say, I don't remember who was down in the cellar, that space that we may or may not have here at the brick store, and they opened a bottle up and it covered the ceiling in this weird dark saison, and that some of that is still on the ceiling of the space, which you'll see in just a little bit. But it's a good confluence, not only of the brick store and Cigar City, but of the very early days of Cigar City. And again, you know, Bob Sylvester was around at that point, and wild days.
So that is Brick Store Pub in Decatur. Trust me, with as awesome as it sounds, the real experience is vastly superior. It's just an amazing place to go to. Our next episodes, we are going to be staying in Georgia. Things that I was able to get started when I was there, but had to finish up online. So you're going to hear a little bit of phone calls, which is fine. But I've got a couple of other great interviews that are coming up pretty soon. In the meantime, please make sure to follow us on social media. We are at Florida Beer Blog on Instagram and Twitter, at FL Beer Blog on Facebook, on the internet at floridabeerblog.com and floridabeerpodcast.com. We are also a very proud member of the Florida Podcast Network, and you can find out all about their amazing shows at floridapodcastnetwork.com or their closed Facebook group, FPN Insiders. Just search for that, send a request, and they'll get you in. If you need to contact us for any reason, please do so at floridabeerblog@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. Our intro announcer is Jeff Brozovich. Field producer is Steve Piccola. Executive producer for the Florida Podcast Network and Grand High Poobah is Jimmy Lagonier. This is David Butler, your host and author. Thank you so much. We will be back in Georgia next week. Have a great day. And even though you're in Georgia, drink Florida craft.